Hello, let's keep going with our study of organization. So let's talk about spatial organization. So this section we're going to be talking about different ways that we can arrange and organize the spaces of a building. In a typical building program, there are usually requirements for various kinds of spaces. And so some of those requirements is that they have to have specific functions, they have to be flexible in use sometimes, they are singular, unique to their functions, so they have similar functions. It can be grouped together, require exterior amount of light, must be segregated for privacy, must be easily accessible. So then as you start getting the program, we've talked about the idea of program, you're going to start creating, color coding or any way you like to organize, and you're going to start, separating by a lot of different concepts. So one of the ways you're going to, this is some of the ways that we can start organizing our space. We already talked about what are spaces. So spaces can be adjoining, can be space within a space, can be, have a common space area. So we understood that, but now let's organize the spaces. So there is five that we're going to be talking about: centralized, linear, radial, clustered, and grid organization. Let's start with centralized organization. So a centralized organization is a stable, concentrated composition that consists of a number of secondary spaces grouped around a large dominant central space. So the big idea is that there's a dominant central space and secondary group spaces. So as you can see in this diagram, the center, all of these lines are sort of pointing at this. The center becomes a dominant space, and everything around it simply is flowing from it. It's connected to it and somehow is deriving from it. So let's see into some examples to help you understand that. So one of this is San Lorenzo de' Maggiore in Milan, Italy. And you start seeing how in these different diagrams, which are not really talking too much about this one, but they're exploring the same idea. You start have the central plan, the central main thing, and then you have different things happening that are being connected, and perhaps an entrance here, perhaps also sort of, again, different spaces, different rooms perhaps, but all of it sort of being secondary to the center. In this basilica that we see in the San Lorenzo, you start seeing how this becomes the main place. It's a place of gathering. It's a place where different people come together. So it's a big gathering of people. But again, it's separated by different spaces, such as little chapels happening. You have your different, maybe a cloister, so a place specifically for the monks, and separated from the public. And so you start getting all these different spaces that are secondary, but are still a big part of what's happening in the main room. Another idea is linear organization. So this is a series of spaces organized along an axis or a path, and we'll talk about axis a little bit more later on. And these spaces can be repetitive, but they don't have to be alike in size or form. And the path also does not have to be straight. So the idea of linear organization is just creating spaces next to each other. And again, it doesn't have to be a straight, it could start moving. So the line does not have to be just straight. It could be, like this, but then your spaces are sort of placed here, and you still get this sort of linear organization. And so let's see examples of people using that. So a big common example of linear organization, and I think we've all seen this at one time or another, it's schools. So in school, you have this huge sort of hallway, and in between you have a linear organization of spaces of different rooms, restrooms, and things like this. So if we look at this in plan view, I want you to imagine this is a plan of this. You will have a huge hallway right at the center, and then you will have spaces that are organized linearly perhaps on both sides, and then you have, you know, your door openings to each of these rooms, but they're all in this linear fashion, happening here and then happening on both sides of these hallway. Why do you think they do that? Most likely because, you know, you want to keep everything organized, you want to keep everything controlled, and it's easier to see, you know, students getting out in the hallway. It also saves space, it also saves time. There's a lot of reasons why this way works for this. Also maybe for offices, maybe for other types of buildings, but it wouldn't work for everything. This is a dormitory done by Albert Alto at the MIT campus in Cambridge, in the US. And says it's again very interesting how he does this. He again, dormitories, usually if you've been to a dormitory or a hotel or things like that there's many rooms. Again, if we think a bit about a hotel, usually it's the same. You know, you have this and then you have, sorry, that line went too far, but you have different rooms. And so these become linear, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's similar what he's doing here. The reason I wanted to show this one is because it's not technically linear. It's, you know, sort of curving around and moving around. So the idea of linear organization does not mean that it has to be a straight line. It could move around. But at the same time, they're all organized in this linear manner, just sort of coming, facing this wall. So another one is radial organization. This one has a dominant central space with paths extending in a radial manner, and so the big thing about this, the big difference between centralized, we talked about centralized, centralized has an inward focus versus radial has an outward focus. So when we talked about centralized, it's saying that it has an inward focus. So that means that this is the main space, and everything here, they're secondary, right? This is what we said previously. So what that means is that and this is basically what it's saying, is like everything is sort of trying to come back to this. It's trying to connect to this because this is the main thing, right? And so, but with radial organization as an outward focus, what this means is that everything starts from here and everything goes to here. Everything goes out. And so every time you want to do anything in the space like this, you have to come back to this. You have to sort of everything is flowing from this. So this becomes not only the central, but becomes the main sense of movement throughout the building. So an example of this is the ADT Technology Campus building. So hopefully you've been here, or if you haven't, hopefully you get to go soon. But this is the building where our campus is located, or where we are studying right now. And if you see it from, this is a Google Maps aerial view, and if you see it, you see that it's in radial organization. So that means is that right at the center, this is where all the sort of movement, we have a central staircase happening right here at the center. And right here you have, it goes out this way, it goes out this way, and it goes out this way. And so if you go through every one of these hallways, you'll find different rooms. And so hopefully you understand that these rooms are also placed in linear organization. So we're combining two, we're combining radial with linear that is happening here. And this happens also here, here, here. And it's also very similar to a common space, because this does become the common space. But again, the difference is that you have to come back to this always in order to keep moving for this space. So this is a good example of radial organization. Hopefully next time you go, you see this differently. Another thing is clustered organization. This one relies mostly on proximity. It relies on including repetitive spaces that may be very similar in function. The spaces may be related by axis symmetry, but they also be grouped around entry point or along the path. So the clustered it's very easy to understand, but it could be tricky to do. You have to, not just put them all together. So basically, it's just, thinking. I think I have another image right next. No. So basically, it's just you have a lot of circles, right? And you have squares. And so is this idea of putting all the squares together and all the circle together. In this case, circle could mean they need light. They need exterior light. In this case, square could mean they don't need a lot of light. They're more private. And you can have rectangles. And in this case, rectangle means we're going to a library can mean bookshelf area, right? So you start getting your different functions, your different needs of the spaces, the different needs of orientation, the different things that are going to be happening, and you can start, sort of clustering them or combining them into something. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. As I mentioned, it can be organized by an axis or something in the middle, sort of creating this symmetry, sharing just a common space. Repetitive spaces, centralized, we talked about centralized, contained within a space. So there's a lot of different ones. So I encourage you to go look into your book and sort of, see one of each ways and start understanding them and see which one you like the best. So an example of that is this house in Pasadena, California. This is the camp. So this is the Gamble House, and you can see this is a very Art Deco type of architecture done, and this is mainly the architect really wanted to create something that fighting this idea of modernism, that everything is industrialized, and wanted to create everything more artistic and done by hand. So a lot of what you see in this house has really been done, designing them with their own hands, and some more physical versus mass production. So this house is actually in California, and the family eventually gave it to the college in California, and also gave it to the state. So now it's a museum. So if you're ever in Pasadena, you can go visit this. But we start seeing how in this area they start, organizing this cluster of spaces. So depending on what's happening, you can start seeing how all of these spaces are you sort of have something happening here, a cluster of space, and then you have something in the middle, which is more sort of, common space area that we've talked about, and then you have another type of cluster of spaces here. So since it's a house, and most likely you'll see this in houses, you'll see that this is a restroom, more private, things like this, that, you can even see how, let me erase this, in order to see any of these hallways, you can't, there's a door here. So if you're here, you don't know what's happening in any of these spaces. Here you do have an opening, but still you don't really know what's happening. So the architect was really clustering spaces of more private versus more public spaces, with combining them with the common space. So now hopefully you start thinking of how you want to. So this one supposed to say grid organization. So disregard that. It should say grid organization. So space is organized within a field structure grid. Grids create regularity and establish a stable set or field of reference points, and grids may be transformed by adding or subtracting layering. So grids really, I do like to work with grids when I design. It helps also structurally. You start knowing where, your beams will start running. So if you need structure, you don't want a long beam, you don't want, so then also you can keep your column small. So grids sort of help you structurally, but also help you in organization. Some people don't like it because it seems a bit more structured, but I really, really think having a grid makes it a lot more controlled, or a lot more, not controlled in a negative way, but more that you have more control of what you're designing. So So when you start looking into a grid, you start seeing, okay, this is I'm gonna keep it in the grid. And this is my negative space. That's sort of my open space, but everything else is there. And so even abstract shapes can start taking place, or they're not. And so now everything has a certain idea that you're following. So I think I have an example of that. So an example is the Casa Boisonas by Philip Johnson. And so again, we talked about Philip Johnson as one of the greatest, and we talked about how he did the glass house, and you can sort of see glass house happening here as well. Again, the idea of glass again just happening. You see this open space, different spaces being connected, maybe even separated by the nature of these plants happening, and you see the idea of the greenery coming into the house is a big part of the concept. But here you can really see a sort of grid layout that he used, right? Even the columns that he's using, the separation of the rooms, you can really see the grid layout. This is also very done in Japanese architecture. And you start seeing how everything falls almost perfectly into this grid. So you're playing with a lot of different ideas of common space, adjoining. You can even see linear organization here. You can see a lot of different things happening, but how are you organizing? And in this case, Philip Johnson is using this grid, which again, for me is one of the personal things I really enjoy doing when I start designing. The first thing I do is I lay out a grid, and it really does guide me throughout the whole thing. This happens a lot in architecture, even in the old times. So this is a mosque in Morocco. And again, you start seeing, even though there's nothing happening here, you can sort of see these lines happening. And even though there's no lines here, you can sort of start imagining how the lines just simply go from side to side. And that really, there's this mathematical beauty that I think that comes from this sort of idea of a grid, of laying out everything proportionate to each other. So this will conclude this lecture, but there will be a third part where I'm going to be talking about the last thing, which is circulation governed by organization. So please go ahead and go look at the third part of this video, and which will be the last part. Thank you.